one of the things that we wanted to talk about is how do we design portfolios? What changes have we made in the current portfolio mixes? And how we work with model portfolios. Many of you are in the model portfolios that we manage. Some of you aren't, and your accounts are just individually managed. But overall, when you look at portfolio design, the big important thing about it is diversification. And why is diversification so important? And it's one of the things that you hear all the time about investments, but nobody ever goes into depth about why that is such a big part of investing. And statistically, what asset class you're invested in impacts your portfolio performance 86%. The individual holdings and what you pick in each of those asset classes is the remaining of your performance. If you look at the dark green, for instance, dark green is international stocks. And you can see each one of these rows is 1 year. So if we've got 2003 here where my cursor is, and the top performing asset class was international emerging market. That's the purple. And then the next year it was number 3, following year. So emerging markets was high, running high for many years. But 2004, it's down here in the very bottom. And then 2011, it's in the very bottom. 2013 and 14, it's towards the bottom. And each asset class you can look at in the same way, where there's international developed markets is the dark green. It bounces around, it goes down, it comes back up. And this is how diversification works to your benefit when you have a mix of all of these different asset classes. And then over time, rebalancing means that you're in a disciplined way, you're selling the things that are at a higher point. Even if the overall market is down, you still wind up selling things that are holding their value more and buying things that are coming down or are down further. And so over time, that puts you in a disciplined place of selling high, buying low, selling high, buying low. So say you're coming out of this downturn in the internationally emerging markets, and you've sold things that have done better, which maybe just bonds did better that year. You've sold some of your bonds, you've bought into emerging markets. And the next year, when the emerging markets comes back up, you have more shares per dollar. And so over time, you accumulate more shares each time you rebalance your portfolios. So this is the before and after of a portfolio rebalance that we've done. And this is our moderate A portfolios. And if you can look, here's how we look at the diversification in our portfolios from a big picture: cash, US stocks, non-US stocks, and bonds. And then we always have some gold and silver in our portfolios. If you look at the quilt chart, that's what that previous chart is called, you'll see that gold is one of those things that acts in the opposite direction from the overall stock market often. So if the market comes down heavily, gold and silver hold their value. So it gives us something to rebalance against during that turbulent time. And one of the things that happened with our portfolios coming out of, well, actually pre-COVID, so 2019, Stuart and I rebalanced our portfolios with a heavier emphasis on renewable energy. We added different components of renewable energy into our portfolios, and a lot of the exposure led us to having a higher percentage of renewable energy and small company stocks. And so you can see that in the dark blue right here. That's an indication of small company holdings that we had in our previous mix of this portfolio. And that really did well for us in 2020. The orange line here is our portfolio performance versus the overall benchmark. So how we compare ourselves is we let Morningstar, that's the program we're using for this analysis, take a mix of the same kind of assets in the overall stock and bond market and tell us, if we were just in the overall blend of stocks and bonds, where would we be at versus our individual holdings? And coming out of COVID and into 2021, we massively outperformed the overall market. And that was in large part because of the renewable energy focus that we had in our portfolios. Unfortunately, since then, renewable energy, because of interest rates going up, and interest rates overly affect small companies because small companies rely more heavily on borrowing. That has impacted small company stocks and they've been hit hard. It's also impacted anything that acts like a utility or utilities, because utilities pay dividends, and anytime interest rates go up, anything that's giving dividends out goes down in value because you can go out and buy a bond at less risk, make more interest. And so that also impacts the utility stocks. And so we had a stronger pullback in our portfolios than the overall market in 2022 into 2023. We weren't heavily into AI. And so we didn't get that initial burst of energy in this market earlier in this year. And so we went in and we hired an economist to look through our portfolios with us and give us some ideas for how to not abandon our thesis, because we really think that long-term renewable energy, changing the energy infrastructure globally, is where we want to be invested, because not only for our ethics, but also financially, we think that that's really where the growth era of the next decade is going to be, the growth energy is going to be. And so what he suggested is that we look at moving our investments from the small company stocks and bringing in more large company stocks. And we looked at that from a couple of different points of view. One, to diversify our portfolios in a more moderate way. As you can see, the after, we're following the indexes that we're measuring against much more closely, which was the whole goal of this. We want people to say, how are our portfolios comparing to the overall market? We want to be closer in the match, both on the upside and the downside. We like giving good news, but it's no fun when the news is followed by bad news the next year. So we wanted to do that, but also looking at the Inflation Reduction Act and how the flow of money is coming into the marketplace through the grant writing at both the federal level and the state level, and the lending facilities at the federal level especially. We think that large companies that are going into the area of renewable energy, of rebuilding grid infrastructure, of creating new microgrid systems, those companies are better positioned to put those grants through quickly, to receive the grant money into them, to put forward big infrastructure projects. And so we introduced in a lot of our portfolios an ETF called Grid. And that is primarily large companies, some mid-sized companies that are moving from more traditional industrial activities into supporting green infrastructure, the new grid infrastructure, clean technologies. So it's meant a compromise in our impact reporting, because some of those companies are old school utilities that have now decided to have a big commitment to rebuilding their infrastructure, but they still have a carbon footprint that is higher than we want it to be. But all of the companies in that ETF are moving in the direction of supporting clean technology and renewable energy and green infrastructure. And so it did the job of diversifying our portfolios and to support companies that are making a really big change. And one of the things that Stuart and I have really bonded over the years is pragmatism in trying to make change happen in the world. Not trying to say we're only going to invest in the good and the pure and the true, but we're going to invest in companies that are making change and can be pushed to make change faster and faster. And those companies have gigantic footprints. You change the carbon footprint of a multinational corporation, and that is a significant lessening of carbon. So moving some of our investments from the small companies into the large companies, I think, is meeting multiple goals on that. The Inflation Reduction Act, which never, I don't like that name because it really wasn't the Inflation Reduction Act, but it was the Green New Deal in different terms. And I pulled this graphic because it points out that the whole focus of this energy transition bill is really carrots over sticks. It's really about how do we incentivize companies and individuals and utilities and states and local municipalities? How do we incentivize them to move towards green energy, clean technology? There's some money that we don't like where it went. There's some money that was a concessionary to the other side of the aisle to get that bill passed. But for the most part, this is having some really big positive impacts. And one of the positive impacts, we talked about the contraction of the labor market, but one of the big impacts is the creation of new jobs. So this is a chart that's showing what states are going to be impacted by the growth of new jobs. Ironically, Texas is right up there because Texas is one of the states that has the most renewable energy production right now and growth in production. They've got a great wind operation there, and they'll continue to benefit from that. Some of these are short-term jobs in that they're building out infrastructure, and some of them are longer-term industry growth jobs that are going to be there for quite a while. And then the other thing that came to my attention about the Inflation Reduction Act and lessening of carbon in the atmosphere and all of the investment that we're doing is the number of avoided negative health outcomes as of 2030 that are projected. We don't hear about this very often as a side effect of this bill, but it's really going to have a serious impact in human lives and well-being. And what isn't being accounted for here is the animal and plant life that we're also contributing to, hopefully, a better life for all living things on the planet. And that brings up just one more aspect of the bill that I'm not sure that people are aware of, but the drug provisions for Medicare and Medicaid were radically changed as in this bill. And so over the next 6 years, you can see there's a progression of changes. Last year, there was a cap on monthly insulin costs for type 2 and type 1 diabetes. They eliminated the cost share for vaccines. This year, after, I don't know who on this call is part of the Medicare system, but if you've got drug costs, you begin by paying a copay, and then you hit what's called the donut hole, where you basically are paying out of pocket for your drugs. And then you hit a cap, and then after that, what's traditionally happened is you go back into a copay mode. But this year, they've eliminated that next co-insurance payment after the donut hole. They've expanded the eligibility for lower income subsidies. Next year, the Medicare Part D, which is the prescription drug benefit, gets a cap of $2,000 per year of out-of-pocket expenses. So that's going to make a huge difference in people's lives. I've talked to people who don't get their medication because they can't afford to go through that donut hole. And then over the following 4 years, the ability of Medicare to negotiate drug costs kicks in. And so the top, I think 60, 30, yep, the top 60 high cost Medicare drugs are going to be negotiated on price.